Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we are now live. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on your location. So we are just gone live for the June ENSO seminar, which will be given in a few minutes by Ezequiel de Paolo. As is normal at this stage of the proceedings, though, we're going to just pause for a moment or two to allow people to log on. And we are, I think, expecting possibly one or two more live participants. If you have just logged on and are interested in participating in the live presentation, if you can send me an email, you'll possibly have received an email from me inviting you to the seminar in general. But if you send me an email, I can send out the live link to you in just a moment or two. Yeah, so this is I think our 15th ENSO seminar.
That sounds right, yeah.
And we have a long stretch of set seminar. We're going to have a July hiatus to give some acknowledgement to the fact that academics actually take summer holidays sometimes. And then from August, we'll be kicking straight back into a consistent run of seminars covering a nice range of topics actually as well. So,
I have one advertisement that I can speak about while we're waiting for people to join, which is that the philosophy department at the University of Auckland has just advertised a new lectureship permanent position that's come available where
I'm afraid you have
frozen.
We've lost Matthew there. Okay, so I think I'm sure he'll come back in just a moment. But good to know there's jobs out there. Okay, so we might. I've just had another request for a live link, so we'll give people maybe just 1 or 2 more minutes to log on. In the meantime, actually, now is probably a good time to plug the book, Ezequiel. Your new book, Sensorimotor Life. If you want to, if you pull up the graphic, I can show your screen.
I could show it to you like this.
Oh, awesome! Even better.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to give us the abstract?
I will be mentioning a few things about it in the talk itself, but this is, if you like, putting together some work that had been going on for the last 4 or 5 years with colleagues, with Thomas Burman and Xavier Barandiran, on what was initially questions concerning the sensorimotor approach to perception, but soon it began to be bigger than that, and we were addressing more fundamental questions from an enactive perspective. That ended up being, if you like, a coherent whole, and then in a way that justified trying to put it together as a book, although some of this work has been published originally as papers. So that's the idea of it, and the idea is to maybe extend or advance the enactive approach towards more specific theories of sensorimotor engagement and sensorimotor life, as we call it. So that's going to be, if you like, the plot of the book. I mean, I'm going to say a few more things specifically about sensorimotor agency in the talk. But that, not much more than that for the moment.
Okay. Sounds cool. I haven't actually managed to pick up my copy yet, but it's on order. Looking forward to it.
I only got mine yesterday, to be honest.
Oh, wow.
It took a while. But yeah, I'm happy about it. Yeah. So,
available in all good bookshops, as they say.
Yes, yes. I'm quite surprised. It's quite elegant, the format. I was suspecting something different, but much more smaller. But I quite like it.
Good.
So
Okay.
Just happy about it.
So I think we have our complement of people we're expecting live, with the exception of we do seem to have lost Matthew, but I'm sure he'll be back on as soon as his internet connection allows. But I guess this is probably a good time to kick off the actual presentation. So it is with distinct pleasure that I can invite Professor Ezequiel Paolo to present the June ENSO seminar. Ezequiel was at the University of Sussex, where I did my own doctoral research and had the unique, or not quite unique, privilege of being one of the extended panel who had to meet with me every once in a while and say things were going okay. But having finished up at Sussex, you're now in the Iker Basque University in San Sebastian in Spain. Do I have that right? The University of the Basque Country?
It's the University of the Basque Country, and Iker Basque is like a science foundation. Yeah.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
So but sort of without further ado, then I can invite you to begin your talk on the zero mode of human activity.
Okay, I'm going to share the screen. Let me know if that works. How's that?
Yep.
Yep. Okay. So, thank you. I mean, what I would like to talk about today is not something entirely new. It's not a fully developed idea. It is perhaps a new take on observations that have been made in the past, in combination with the suggestion that several of these observations may probably be seen as part of the same phenomenon, what I will call the zero mode of human activity. Some points I will make in this talk are connected to the book which has talked about, that has been recently published. Although the specific topic of the zero mode, we only dedicated a few pages towards the end of the book. So it's still very much an open-ended topic. I will briefly introduce the idea that human minds, or human activities, practices as I prefer, can be described as roughly falling into 4 modes, according to developmental psychologist Margaret Donaldson. Then I will argue that apart from these modes, human activities have a pervasive additional mode of operation. I will relate the notion of the zero mode of human activity to the everyday experiences that we have, and sometimes we can also describe in dynamical terms, dynamical systems terms, and I will mention some neuroscientific considerations too. Then in the next part of the talk, I will introduce briefly the idea of sensorimotor agency, which is something we do develop in the book, one of the main contributions of it. And we will see how we can make sense of the activity of the zero mode with the descriptions of this concept of agency. And if I have time, I will say a few things about how these ideas, these inactive ideas, relate to materialism. So, on to describing these modes of the human mind, according to Margaret Donaldson. One thing, the context for this is that, in cognitive science, particularly in discussions about embodied cognition, we often hear debates about cognitive gaps, the distinctions between so-called online and offline cognition, higher and lower mental functions, etc. And research in the embodied camp tends to be fenced in within regions that pertain to online activities, low-level sensorimotor engagements, but they're deemed unable to move outside these regions. These, to my mind, are spurious distinctions. They betray a dualistic way of thinking. Our bodies are not less involved when we are running than when we are trying to split the restaurant bill. They are just involved differently. And Margaret Donaldson, instead of using this very dichotomous way of thinking, provides a useful and more subtle breakdown of different kinds of human activities according to the locus of concern that they entail. I think that this is a very useful practical description that is motivated empirically and would require still further consideration from a theoretical perspective, but nevertheless, I think it's very good from our purposes here. So what she says is that when we are concerned with the here and now, we are acting in what she calls the point mode. This is what the case when we're trying to sort out an obstacle in the street, but also the case when we're trying to estimate the exchange rate when we're buying something in a foreign shop. This is, in a way, the mode in which our activity is concerned with ourselves and our current situation. When the concern is extended over time towards the near future, the near past, or nearby places, but still concerns our own activities, we are in what she calls the line mode. This is what we do when we prepare for some activity we will perform later, like when we pick up an umbrella, when we see that the sky promises rain later on. If we are concerned with goals and activities that have to do not so much with our own situation, but generally with things that happen in the world, in other places, anywhere, at any time, we are in what she calls the construct mode. And finally, there's no particular place or time, but we are dealing with, for instance, abstract ideas or general questions about ethics, social norms, concepts, etc. This is a transcendent mode. We must notice here that in our daily activities, we're often engaged more than one mode at once. We are often doing things that involve all these modes together sometimes. But that's what I want to say, that we're not dealing here with a very, very strict distinction, but it's like a phenomenological, in the scientific sense of the word, way of describing the empirical ways of human activities. Now, the thing is that not counting what goes on when we're falling asleep or when we're sleeping, we find that a good part of the day, we don't seem to be engaged in any activity that could easily be described as an example of one particular mode in Donaldson's categorization. And I know here that I will be lumping together different phenomena and situations, but what they have in common is that they are not examples of any of Donaldson's modes, hence the generic umbrella term, the zero mode. So sometimes we're just idle, we're not doing anything. Other times we're waiting, or we are not really active because other people are active for us. Conversely, sometimes we have situations of indecision and being pulled between different goals, or ambiguities and hesitation. We are often sometimes thrown into activities that have no purpose other than themselves, such as fidgeting, such as activities that perpetuate patterns of action that are not directed anywhere, or sometimes we're just not doing much, we're just hanging around. We sometimes often also find ourselves at the extremes of human emotion and behavior, where we are overwhelmed by the materiality of our bodies, such is the case of episodes of emotions such as laughter, crying, rage, or states of the body such as hunger and weakness. I'm not saying that these states would not end up followed by some activity that could be described in one of Donaldson's modes, but sometimes these states in themselves are there present to us without ourselves being engaged in any particular activity. And the zero mode can be induced artificially, and the typical example would be the experiments in prolonged sensorimotor disruption, such as the inversion of the visual field. So, I'm going to say something very briefly here. I'm not going to say much about the work of Gilbert-Simondon, only to highlight that it is probably very useful in that it provides a relevant framework to start asking questions about what is going on in the situations in which sense-making emerges or acts get actualized. His notion of the pre-individual as the milieu of potentialities and tensions out of which individuated states emerge is theoretically rich and can be helpful, I think, here. And in this context, the zero mode, broad as this notion is, could be characterized as the becoming of individuated acts of sense-making. In didactic literature, we call that inaction. How about how such situations have been studied, for instance, in neuroscience? I'll bet something very, very brief here, otherwise the talk will get too long. We have, on the one hand, the work of Francisco Varela on neuronal cell assemblies, the work on chaotic itinerancy by Ichiro Suda, the work of Scott Kelso on coordination dynamics and metastability, and the work of Walter Freeman on chaos and attractor formation in the brain. I believe all this work, in a way, is saying similar things about these transitions, dynamical transitions from states of rather undefined acts or activities into more individuated, more defined ones. So just briefly, Suda's chaotic itinerancy on the right is a way of describing the passages, the dynamical passages between quasi-stable or metastable attractors or quasi-attractors in brain dynamics, which are sufficient to sustain certain older low-dimensional activity for a while, but then spontaneously may just simply move on to some high-dimensional search for a new attractor. And this is often described in terms of metastability, and Kelso has done a lot of work on this. And where we see on the left the different kinds of possibility when you have different stable regimes, in this case, is couple oscillators. But the interesting one is, for Kelso, and in this context of this talk, is the metastable regime, in which there are periods of dwelling in some low-dimensional coordinated state, but there are moments in which that state or the whole system escapes those states. And this doesn't necessarily have to be due to a response to external stimuli or perturbations. It could be just intrinsic in the dynamics. Well, another thing worth mentioning is the work of Francisco Varela on the shadow of perception experiment, and I'm sure many of you here will be familiar with it. Just if we focus on the top row here, we have a situation where a participant is asked to recognize a face or in a projected image, and the moment of recognition is actually marked by long-range correlations in synchronization in the gamma band, which is the thing that is described in the second stage with those dark lines connecting different points in the brain. And then when recognition happens, the participant has to press a button or release a button, I can't remember. And the moment where that act, the button press, it happens, again, at the end, we have all those dark lines showing a lot of synchronization. But what is interesting is that in between those two moments, the moment of recognition and the moment of action, there is this massive decorrelation or desynchronization of all these states, as if, again, we're traveling from a low-dimensional, very committed state towards a state of openness and high dimensionality, and a very quick transition between these two tasks. So that's kind of showing that there is a phenomenology of the zero mode that we can recognize in our everyday activities. And there is a dynamical account of what goes on in it. The phenomenology, briefly, just to repeat, is recessive in the sense that it's hard to catch what goes on in those quick transitions, because precisely we are not focused. Our situation is not intentional in the sense of, in the Husserlian sense of intentionality. There is a self-affection of the body that is dominant at that moment. And what happens is that we are moving towards states of commitment, but not in them. The opposite, the contrast with that, is when our intentionality is focused, we are committed. If we have the skill, we're coping skillfully. And there's a sense that we are agents of our actions. Dynamically speaking, this correlates again with a contrast between high-dimensional, chaotic, irreversible dynamics and these non-stationary transition moments towards metastability, situations that could be approached in a stationary description, perhaps, but not the transitions between them. And these tend to be also path-dependent, and it's very hard to argue that these transitions are ergodic. I didn't mention that here, but that's something to also remember. The contrast, again, is when we're committed to a state of sense-making. It could be recognition, the perception of something, or engage in a sensorimotor act. And that's characterized by a lower dimensionality, more entangled modes of activity across several timescales, something I didn't mention, but it would take too long to describe that, and situations of metastability and coordination. So that's roughly what we have characterized as the zero mode. Now, the question is, can we... And I will introduce in the next part of the talk the concept of sensorimotor agency. Realize that the concept itself might be not really necessary for what I want to do in the talk, but one aspect of how we describe this concept is useful. And this is, I think it's going to get clearer as we go on. But there are some quotes here. Perhaps there's no point reading them right now. Just to say that the concept of sensorimotor agency has antecedents in the sense that people have been thinking about these complex relations between being and doing. Specifically, some people like Susanne Langer or Christine Korsgaard have suggested that it is the actual acts of the agent or the activities of the agent that define the agent or that continually assert their agency. And this is a strange circular way of putting things, because surely the acts must be the acts of an agent to begin with. Well, but it's that circularity that we want to explore. So in activism, we do have a concept of agency that has been discussed before. And it has to do with the joint occurrence of these three requirements of individuation, asymmetry, and normativity. It would take me a while to explain this, but essentially what we're talking about is that when we talk about agencies or agents, we're talking about entities that are self-individuated, that do something in the environment as opposed to simply being coupled to the environment, and therefore we must introduce some concept of asymmetry in the sense that sometimes their actions in the environments are not simply just couplings, and they are. On the left, we can see that there is a description of what they are. They are regulations of couplings, but nevertheless, I don't want to go into that now. And that these changes, these modulations of the coupling are actually normatively driven, in this case, by the conservation of the conditions and the viability of the individuated agent itself. But agents may eventually also respond to external norms as well. So that's the context. I mean, that has been done before. This is not new. What is new in the book is that we apply this idea to a new level of agency. Let's put it like that. So to see this, we have to say a few things about sensorimotor schemes. So here I'm using the typical Piagetian description of a circular sensorimotor scheme, such as a baby drinking from a milk bottle. And we have different sensorimotor coordinations, which are these color arrows, and they're described by this Piagetian notation, that A times A prime, where the A, B, C describe structures of support from the agent's side, in the agent's body, the nervous system, neural activity, etc. And the A primes, B primes, C primes, they describe structures of support from the environmental side. So you see each of these sensorimotor coordinations is this joining of agent and environment. And they do, in this case, form a cycle. And what's interesting is that the cycle has normative implications. And you could say, well, does the cycle close? Does it not close? Do we go from situations in which some things are going wrong, such as, you know, the baby cannot breathe well, or he's choking or something? So all these normative aspects are interesting because they are what they drive the processes of accommodation and assimilation. So in a way, we're not just talking here of the combination of 3 random sensorimotor coordinations, but rather we are talking about a whole that is, if you like, sustaining itself in some sense, and for which things are good or bad. But this becomes even clearer when we look at the concept of a habit. Now let's use the same concept of the sensorimotor scheme, or the sensorimotor, this diagram we had before. And now let's imagine that the environmental support size and the environmental structure and the values are not stable, in the sense that, well, over time things may change and the sensorimotor scheme may not be possible in the future. But let's assume that it is the inaction of this sensorimotor coordination that stabilizes some of these unstable support aspects. So these are these dash arrows that we see in the figure. So in some case, when you're enacting A times A, that somehow gives a boost against the decay or precariousness of support structure C, and so on. So this is in this Piagetian dynamical term, this is what we normally call a sensorimotor habit. It is a sensorimotor scheme whose enaction predisposes its further inaction by fighting against those factors that would tend to make it unstable. It is a bit of a stronger definition than the normal definition of habits, which is simply that there is a predisposition to repeat the pattern. Here there is a predisposition to repeat the pattern, without which that predisposition could not exist. That's what I'm trying, that there's a subtle difference here. That has to do with the precariousness of the support structures. But if you want to say that maybe there is agency at the sensorimotor level, that is to say, something that is individuated, normative, and asymmetric at the level of action, at the level of acts, well, we might think this is a good candidate, habits that are good candidates. But when we look at in the phenomenology, we really are not just engaged in single habits. We're often engaged in networks of activities. But we can easily extend the concept of a self-supporting habit to the concept of a self-supporting network of sensorimotor schemes. So here you should imagine the previous diagram here extended to, in this case, having 4 sensorimotor schemes forming a network of relations of stabilization. That is to say, the dashed lines stabilize the support structures of other sensorimotor schemes. And those depends on the inactions of a particular sensorimotor scheme. So you need to enact S2 in order to stabilize some structures in S1 and S3. Not only that, but we also know that schemes are not enacted in isolation. They're enacted in clusters that connect to each other. Sometimes in parallel, we do things that are mutually supportive, sometimes in sequences, and so on. So we have this broader lines also connecting schemes in some form of functional connection. Now, you can see where I'm going with this, because first I have a self-supporting structure that was a single habit, but I extended that idea to a network of sensorimotor schemes. And when you look phenomenologically at this, and you see an activity such as lighting up a cigarette, this example is nicely developed by Nikolai Bernstein. we see the connection of all the little sensory motor coordinations and schemes together into some kind of whole. But this whole is not the same as a plan, it's not a script, it's not, there are norms internal to the activity itself, but there's also some kind of open-endedness in how these things, these schemes vary, and they might be enacted in many different ways. But as we are skillful in one activity, we easily can recognize when the activity is either flowing and moving forward, or there is something that disrupts the activity. So there is, if you like, a flexibility, but at the same time, a normativity about it. So, extending a little bit that notion of the network, imagine through development, this network growing into different activities and different clusters that are here shown in different colors, meaning that there are what Varela calls micro-worlds or micro-identities, things we do that have, if you like, the regional normativity, what's regionally right or wrong about them, and the flows and conditions of breakdown. And these can be anything from, you know, getting dressed in the morning or doing home repairs or going to the cinema and so on. These are different from each other, and sometimes we use schemes that belong to more than one activity. The whole network metaphor can be useful for many, many other aspects, but I think it kind of is at this moment merely a description of the fact that we have structured domains of action that are regional. Now, interestingly, that this description, we have a smaller version on the left, of the structural connections between sensory-motor schemes can be used to make sense of the actual enaction, the actual function of sensory-motor schemes as extending the links of a particular sensory-motor scheme which is enacted to priming others, inhibiting others, and then we have no, we're not only, you know, performing a particular task such as picking up the mug to drink, we'll do it, pick up the mug to drink some coffee, or we pick up the mug to put it away in the cupboard. These are complex relations of priming and inhibition in the functional aspect of it. So, this is just simply a summary of the things I've just said, and I will move on to how this idea might help us make sense of the zero mode. So when we are in the zero mode, let's think about this structure I just mentioned. Well, we might think that the zero mode is what goes on in these transitions between activities. So that's a good first approximation to it. So if we tell the story that Francisco Varela tells in one of his articles, that you're strolling along quite without much worry in the street one day because you're making time and you don't have anything to do and you're distracted by sounds and people. This is one situation in which you are one micro world. But then suddenly you put your hand in your pocket and you realize your wallet isn't there. And then suddenly things change radically. Did the wallet drop somewhere? Did you leave it at the bar when you were having a drink, or at the shop when you were buying some cigarettes? Should you inform the police? And so on. You are literally thrown into space between worlds, between micro worlds, let's put it, in which it's not so easy to really reconstitute your activity and imagine that you start doing things without being fully decided to, making sure that that's the right way to, that makes sense in one world will not make sense in another. So in our description of this network of sensory motor schemes, what we have is a situation where we are maybe located in one particular activity, like strolling about and not doing much, and then something throws us out of that activity and we are in search of a new stable situation, which we finally find. Let's go back to the shop and see if it is there. So that's how we understand the zero mode from this perspective, as these dynamical transitions. And these transitions occur between activities because of breakdowns, but not necessarily breakdowns. It could just simply happen. And they're usually fast. Normally we just know quickly what to do, but not always. Sometimes the states of ambiguity persist. Sometimes we are engaged in some activity and we hear some very, very tragic news, and some people react by continuing in the current activity, but in some kind of uncanny manner, because they still don't know what to do next. So these ambiguities in motivations, goals, intentions characterize these transitions. And what is important here is that this activity, because I want to call this an activity of the mind, is frame constituting. As important here, it's constituting what is going to be the right frame, the right set of norms that will apply next. But if it is frame constituted, it's not describable in information theoretic terms, because precisely what we don't have is a clear frame in which we can say that these are stationary distributions of states and probability densities and so on and so forth. So interestingly, this is something that cannot be captured by functionalism. A few words just to finish. In fact, it won't be too much because there's a lot to be said here about the link between these things I've been talking about and materialism. I mean, one thing to say that is important, I believe, is this quote by Ricoeur, but in fact we don't need a quote by Ricoeur here. Is the action itself is an event. It initiates novelty in the world. It is no longer a possibility towards the actual, but an aspect of the actual itself, the flesh of a dancing process. That is to say, when we act, we often think that our actions are somehow more than moves. And that's how it's often described in the literature. You know, what makes an action more than a mere move? I believe that that's the wrong way to think about it. I think that acts are embodied in moves, but moves are more than acts. And you can see here in the sensorimotor scheme diagram that I simply just not drawn the fact that each of these sensorimotor coordination has implications for the rest of the world. Not only for the goals that I seek as an agent, you know, from simple things, from the fact that air molecules move around the objects that I'm moving, the glass that I'm taking to my mouth. But of course, that is, well, you say that's trivial. Well, what about not trivial things, such as the tracks that you leave when you're walking in the forest that somebody might follow? These are not things that you necessarily intend, but they're consequences of your actions. And that has to do with their material substrate. What is interesting is that when you look at current versions of studies of active matter, you see that this is a very different conception of the matter as this very inert substrate. We have already very many cases of studies equilibrium, far from equilibrium, macroscopic configurations that exceed the possibilities of normal prediction that we have from much simpler systems that we conceive as reversible, describable, fully describable in terms of simple laws and so on. And I'm not here just saying anything new. I'm just repeating a line of thoughts in Western philosophy that comes from Epicurus down to, you know, Whitehead and Chibas-Simondon again, and scientists like Ilya Prigogine. All I want to say here is that if in an active theory the precariousness of the body is constitutive of sense-making, so we make sense of the world because we care about the world, and we care about the world because our bodies are not guaranteed to be there all the time. The fact is that this precariousness is simply a manifestation of this materiality of macroscopic non-equilibrium configurations. I mean, we call it precariousness with respect to the body that must survive, but it's simply an open-endedness to it. And it is this same open-endedness that underlies activity in the zero mode. It is, in other words, these macroscopic material configurations are not souls that are open-ended, innovative, and spontaneous. And those are the ones we need to understand if we want to understand those aspects of human agency. So just to wrap up a little, we might conclude that this umbrella term, this zero mode, can be characterized as the ongoing actualization of sense-making. And this may occur for many different reasons, and perhaps we should distinguish between those reasons in further studies. This zero mode is manifested during breakdowns, transitions, ambiguities, disruptions, etc. However, it's there all the time. It's there in how, even when we engage in one activity, there's always some element of micro breakdown management that requires a little bit of spontaneity. And the transitions in and out of this manifested zero mode, when we're actually in it, have clear dynamical signatures and have been studied and can be further studied scientifically and phenomenologically. And finally, the sensorimotor agency approach allows us to, well, at least make a fruitful theoretical approximation to this kind of non-logical and non-representational ontology. I think I'm going to end there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Ezequiel. So I think our various live participants can unmute themselves, and if you just signal by waving at your camera that you have, if you have a question or comment that you'd like to make. I think I might ask, I think Inman, I think your cousin might be, your speakers are a bit loud, perhaps there's a bit of an echo, or I'm quite sure what there's an echo coming from somewhere. Sorry, no, it's not.
No, it's Peter. I think it's Peter.
Me. I'll try.
All right, apologies for that. Okay, you had we'll just sort of jump straight to you. I have a whole bunch of questions, but I'll step back for a moment. So Inman, if you'd like to go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Good. Thanks. Great. Thanks for a lovely talk. A comment and a quick question. Comment is lots of similarities between zero mode and Ashby's homeostat and the uniselector and the period of chaos and or randomness between metastable states. So that's just the comment part.
Yeah.
The devil's advocate question is, you emphasized at various points the sort of materiality and how one hopes to go beyond the other side's emphasis on just inaction, just about low-level sensory motor stuff. So how do you relate a person dealing with an abstract mathematical or chess problem, and how do you satisfy or try to satisfy somebody who says this is completely unrelated to materiality in the body?
Okay. Okay, let's just clarify a little bit the claims here. Obviously, in this talk, I'm not saying I'm giving you an active account of mathematical problem solving or anything like that. What I'm trying to say is that let's start by not assuming a dualistic ontology, like the high and low level stuff, but rather let's use this, well, Donaldson's approach to say, well, sometimes we're more engaged in actual doings, such as solving a mathematical problem. And you say, whoa, but that's also transcendent. No, there are abstract ideas. Yes, and we're also screaming on the paper. So the thing here is that to make sense of those gaps, which I'm not claiming I have described here, we still need to have the tools to fill in all the categories that are in between, all the categories of actions. What about to say, well, can you do a mathematical problem, solve a mathematical problem without language, for instance? Oh, okay. Whatever side you come on that question, it might actually still provoke in some way of clarifying what is to solve a mathematical problem as an act. So all of that is work to be done. We are currently working precisely on and filling in that gap between simple forms of interpersonal interactions and language. And there are many, many stages in between that people never talk about. And I think the analogy here is, oh, how do you fill in the gap between offline and online cognition? Something that I don't think is even a good description. Well, I'm saying, well, no, look, there are many, many different things that are actually not even in between. There are alternative ways of characterizing complexity in action, and abstraction, and sophistication. And all that, if you like, is the message that I'm trying to get out here. Well, one of the messages, the other is the zero mode aspect. So I'm not sure that answered the question, but in order to answer the question, I will have to really provide an embodied theory of mathematics. And there are interesting attempts at that, you know, the work of Rafael Nunez, for instance. But more than that, I want to just say, let's step back a problem and understand what kind of questions we're asking. Does it even make sense to just take two things that seem to be very different and just try and push them together and say, like, well, there is embodiment, there is mathematics, let's put them together and see where they interact. Well, what if in between them, there's so many different things we haven't even worked out yet, so many categories we haven't even worked out. So that's the kind of thing that is required before we even try to answer that question.
No, I'd agree with that being the strategy. I just know that it receives a lot of skepticism side, but you have to live with that.
Well, when you receive a lot of skepticism, this is my suggestion, is just turn them back and say, well, has functionalism really explained how we do mathematics? Has representationalism really provided us with an answer? Really? I mean, well, we should have, you know, artificial mathematicians all over the place, and we don't. So no. I think there is skepticism, but it's to be shared with traditional approaches too. That's as simple as that.
Yep.
Okay, so just a quick reminder, so those of us who might be viewing sort of or might be not live participants, there's a Q&A or chat app which might be visible. It's a sort of a blue speech bubble. You'll be able to click and enter text messages there, or you can send me emails, marek.mcgann@gmail.com, which will allow you to, and I'll put voice to your questions. But in the meantime, we have two other present who have indicated their interest in asking questions. Matthew and Peter, I think. Matthew, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, what was my question? Yeah, I was curious what motivates the need to have the networks of activity, the networks of habits, and what a single habit would be. So you have these two levels that you're distinguishing between, but I don't quite understand why you're doing that.
Well, one answer is that we're just following, you know, experience, and we're also following empirical research. It so happens that when you look at in comparative psychology, for instance, or in animal behavior studies, there has been a lot of work describing the network of sensorimotor schemes as networks. The work of John Fentress, for instance, in studies of grooming in rats, or the activity of wolf packs. And they describe these behaviors as following almost a hierarchical. They call it sometimes a hierarchy of when you're grooming, there are certain things you do, you touch your face and so on. And when you're looking for food, there are other schemes that are very unrelated. But curiously enough, when a very young rat that is still developing, often, sometimes in the middle of this food searching behavior, makes a move that resembles a grooming move and touches the whiskers or something, and then stops and does a little bit of a routine of grooming, even though it's totally not necessary at that moment, it seems. And he calls it like a motor trap. And you can see how then the idea of a network, it can be helpful in just giving some structure to these observations. That's one part of the answer. The other part of the answer, well, philosophically also, people have always, you know, from William James, they always spoke about bundles of habits. John Dewey speaks of habits that communicate. I believe there's nothing wrong with a single habit, provided it's understood in the way that we describe in the book, and I know that you and your models understand, which is this precarious entity. Because if it isn't precarious, it kind of hardens into some sort of automatism. And that is not quite what we're looking for, and therefore it's not a good candidate for naturalizing sensorimotor agency. But the fact is that we do simply have networks of habits, or networks of schemes that support themselves. So it's a generalization. There is not a contradiction with the idea of habit. It's a generalization of that idea.
But each individual habit is something that could persist on its own. Would you agree with that? Each one of those, yeah, the individual habits is itself precarious and something that could persist?
Yeah, of course. But I might even call into question the whole notion that empirically there is such a thing as an isolated habit. Mm-hmm. That is unconnected with, simply because of the very fact that we have this body, it's one body. And it's very hard to imagine that I would do certain things that I describe as a habit and would not involve many structures in the body, many neural processes and so on, which are also not used in other activities. To bad habits like smoking is that what happens with this intensity that is there, what do you replace it with? How is it that you end up calling that habit by just doing certain movements that are related to some other activity? So in a way, it's always a very, networked picture that comes back, I believe. Even if we end up saying, well, we can conceive of a single habit, we can conceive of and it makes sense, we can model it. That's great. I think in complex bodies, like human bodies, what we have is eventually this network.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so Peter, you can you had a follow-up question. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you.
Hi, Ezequiel. So, in my reading of the neuroscience, often people talk about default state networks, and of course, the older literature on alpha rhythms. In this sort of state where you're not really attending to anything in particular and you're not really focused on action per se, you're just sort of daydreaming or relaxing. There's, alpha rhythms start to dominate the brain rhythms. So I think that these default state networks are fairly low dimensional dynamics, as I understand them.
Yes.
So rather than sort of being transitional states between actions, it's sort of a resting state. That's sort of a low dimensional kind of internal state, and it's not really geared towards action at all. Mm-hmm. And my second point is I was thinking about it in activism and in relation to how an activist theory would deal with music listening, because music listening is really about modulating internal states, not really in service of externalized action. So my question is, and I discovered your 2014 paper recently on Piaget's equilibration theory, which was a great paper. But in it you say, which I think is shared by other activists, that basically everything is about action and acting in the world. And I guess I would like to suggest that maybe everything isn't action. Sleep isn't action. Meditation isn't action. Listening to music to change your own internal state is not externalized action. so that there's both action and internal regulation of state.
Okay.
So
yes.
so that seems to run counter to some of the more extreme and activist would say that it's nothing, there's no perception without action. Everything is action. There's nothing outside of action.
Yes. Okay, thanks. I mean, that's a great question. And just on the first part, I was going to mention the default network, the default brain network stuff, but then I thought maybe it would be too long. And I only have 20 minutes, and I thought, well, okay, I have to take some things off. But definitely relevant. What I like about that resting state actually is that it's not a quiet state. There are transitions, and when one thing is that we might be a bit mesmerized by that image of, okay, this is the default network, and we see an MRI image with some lighted, regions. But what happens if you look at some of the papers by Reichel, and I actually was going to show that picture here, they make a movie, and what you see is activity flying all around all the time, just totally. Just end up being more represented, and then to call it a default mode network or something like that.
Well, I think it's just a different dynamical state.
And this is your point, and I think it's a good point, that it might be that this is still low dimensional. And I think that's a good point. And one will have to then think about, is there a distinction between that resting state and those things I've been describing that are more like transitions between states or situations of ambiguity when you have to search for new meaning or new things to do. And it might be that perhaps there is, and I don't know, it's an empirical issue, or maybe we need to think about that, yeah, sure. The second point, I totally agree with what you're saying, and many activists have said things that I don't quite share in this sense, that it's all about action, meaning by that there is a very clear overt activity that must be happening. But actually what you describe as internal regulation, I think that's what I think about when I also, or I include that in this term activity. It's something that will have the following characteristics. It's something that may fail. Sometimes it doesn't quite work, this internal regulation. You might actually not be connecting to the music because you're thinking about something else and something like this. It's something that is best ascribed to the personal level as well. It is something that you are doing, but perhaps you're not doing in this volitional sense of, okay, and now I need to do, move around stuff in my house because the movers are coming. No, but it's still something that it's personal, rather than subpersonal mechanisms that take care of that regulation on their own. As of course the subpersonal level is there, and we must explain how that works. But that is the thing. I mean, if you open that possibility to say, well, all perception is about this kind of meaningful activity performed by an agent, either externally and overtly or as internal regulations, then perhaps you can go back to these claims that you couldn't have really perception without some internal regulation, without like focusing your attention to the music, for instance, and attempting to discover new patterns in some song that you heard before. Actually, that I never heard that line, that bass line before. That kind of thing is active, and that's what I believe is my inactive take on that. And in the book, we go a bit further towards the end. Still, because it's towards the end, it's still a bit in the speculative mode. We talk about virtual action. But that we will take a little bit too long to explain, but it's about when you look at this functional network, so you're doing something, but it already primes potential possibilities or inhibits others, and so on. What if you develop the skills to follow that priming a few steps down the line. And you say, well, I'm going to pick up the cover, the cup, to put it back in the cover, and then turn around and go to the outside the kitchen. All of that is already just this flow that is projected. And there is no need to have representations for that. I mean, you have this dynamical description and structural description that already can work. So the virtual action, just to wrap it up, the virtual action would be, what if on top now you have the skill to direct that attention towards, like, well, what if I really want to stay in the kitchen or something like that? And then you just simply modulate that forward path of possibilities. That would be an act 2, because it would be like well, an act, again, an internal regulation, that's also a good word, is something that is regulating your sense making, what's going to happen next.
Okay, well, thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thanks. So we're sort of coming up towards the end, but I'm going to abuse my position to. Well, okay. So Inman has is it a quick question, Inman?
I can make it very quick. It's a comment rather than a question on the notion of low alpha waves, low dimensional dynamics dominating. There's two senses of the word dominate. One is, hey, if you're looking at little wiggles going across the screen, one stands out, a low dimensional stands out. But another sense of dominate means that's the important one. And it's very easy. I've constructed CTRNNs where very low dimensional dynamics, and they're what would scream out at you from the screen, actually promote the possibility for chaotic search, which you cannot see in terms of squiggles on the screen. So the dominance of low dimensional dynamics doesn't mean that is the dominant thing that really matters.
I've always loved the term default mode network because it assumes that the default behavior of a human being is lying on your back in an fMRI machine. But I guess, so one of the things that, so if I can ask my question quickly as well, Ezequiel, which sort of vaguely related to some of the discussion that has gone thus far, and then we should probably then finish up. It has to do with the those sketches of network diagrams that you had. So that I understand that sort of they were intended as illustration rather than sort of metrically. But I'm curious as to what you consider the dimensions in play to be. So at one point, one of your slides included the same network presented twice, one with the phrase, one with the label structural and the other functional. And insofar as that there is sort of overlap or proximity between different sensorimotor habits, what is the things that brings them closer or further away from each other? So is it purely in terms of the dimension, you know, the physical dimensions of movement? Is it their normative behavior within a sort of a wider practice? What makes certain habits closer to one another than others?
Yes, that's a good question. I mean, these networks are just simple hypothetical networks that are there for illustration purposes. But the idea of sensorimotor schemes clustering together we describe that in the book. And the clustering would be the amount of mutually enabled relations that these sensorimotor activities have to each other. So when you see that there are many different sensorimotor schemes that are not necessarily always enacted together, but they kind of support each other, as in the case of the lighting up cigarette, those would tend to form a cluster. Now, of course, there is the structural meaning of that and the functional meaning of that. The structural meaning of that is simply, well, it could be by any kind of mechanism. It could be like Hebbian-like learning, that some sensorimotor schemes enacted together become eventually mutually stabilizing. By stabilizing, I mean the structures that give rise to the scheme, body and in the environment, are somehow corrected from any deviations. There is a counter move towards their precarious degradation and so on and so forth by the inaction of another scheme. So then there is an arrow from one to the other. Then there is the fact that some schemes are necessary to perform others. So I need to, pull the door handle down before I open the door. So those two things mutually are always connected. But these are connected functionally. And I'm not so keen on just making a very, very strong distinction here in how you choose to describe your networks. But the thing is that when you look at it functionally, you're just saying, well, what happens in the case in which you are activating one of these schemes? There's one that's happening right now. What happens to all these connections? The structural connections are mapping out potentialities, inhibitions, other consequences, and so on. That's the idea. That these clusters would eventually, there would be a fantastic project that you actually, let's go and map these networks in human beings. Let's look, that description that from Lighting Up a Cigarette is a one-paragraph description in Bernstein's book of all the detailed things. You take the match out of the box, you close the box, you take it to your face. Let's map all that out, and let's see how these schemes form a network. I think that would be a fantastic project. For the moment, we're just simply trying to have another tool to conceptually look at this, as opposed to at this phenomena, as opposed to, the contrasting tool is that develop new attractors are formed and so on and so forth in development. And that is very useful to give an idea of the dynamics of developmental change, but the attractors at the end do not really connect to each other, and they actually may have very strong connections. You do walking while talking, and maybe those two things go together sometimes. So there must be some way of representing that as well. So that's the idea of the network representation.
Okay. Thanks very much. So I should, just looking at time, we should really start to wrap things up, although I would prefer not to. Would anyone like, I guess, would offer someone the opportunity for one last very quick question, or shall we?
But I'd just like to make one very quick comment, just responding to what Ezequiel said there at the end about lighting the cigarette. It seems to me like the different components that are involved in the action of lighting a cigarette are actions. They're not habits in the sense that you've talked about, today and in the past. It's not that taking the match out of your pocket is something that's somehow a self-maintaining sensory motor action, unless I'm missing something. It's the whole action. Yes, I can see how that's a self-reinforcing thing, but
that's right. It is the case, but that's precisely answers your previous question, that not each of them must be a habit. That's the point. I don't know if I wasn't clear earlier. They not necessarily all self-supporting. It's just maybe the whole that is self-supporting. And actually, as I said, the main message of the idea of sensorimotor agency is something I didn't really go much into in this talk, is that this whole network becomes an identifiable new forms of agency with different norms than your organic norms. I mean, that would be another talk, but that's the point. It's this whole that is individuated, normative, and asymmetrically related to the environment. But many interesting things have occurred, that the environment of the sensorimotor agent is not the same environment of the organic body, because environments are always defined with respect to the system. So if the system is different, and then, you might sensorimotorily engage with parts of your body as if they were objects. You scratch your head and things like that. Or you look at them, and then there will be other forms of agency to do with social agency that we're not discussing at all here. So that's the point, that either one activity becomes self-sustaining, or the whole thing, the whole network becomes self-sustaining, and it must be reaffirmed with each act. Each act that you perform is a way of saying yes to your agency at the same time.
Okay. I think there's a real bridge there through the likes of Chimero's radical embodied cognitive science. There's a real connection with ecological psychology there. I think, except that whereas ecological psychology tends to treat the environment as set and fixed, while it is variable according to the individual agent, if we look at an individual agent themselves as varying substantially moment to moment and developmentally, you end up with ecological psychology essentially transforms into something much more akin to an active thinking. But that's probably a discussion for another time. Okay, well, in that case, it's it remains for me to thank Ezequiel de Paolo again. Thank you for sort of excellent and thought-provoking talk. So we'll pause for the internet equivalent of. And so, as mentioned before, I mentioned that right at the start that we'll have a hiatus in July, but in August, one of our other colleagues here, Christian Guckelsberg, will be presenting the 16th ENSO seminar on the first Thursday in August, which I think is the 3rd, if I yes. So on the 3rd of August, and that's something that we'll all look forward to. So in the meantime, have a enjoyable break, and we'll see you all in August. Thanks.
Okay. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.